Thank you all for joining us for session number 2 of WVU Extension Cider School. This is the first time we've done this, so we're pretty excited to see how it goes, get your feedback on all of this. So please feel free to use that chat box liberally. If you see at the bottom of your screen, or it might be at the top of your screen, it just says chat. Please add information in there. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll question. So that should just be a box that pops up on your screen. And the question is, tell us your role within the cider industry. And you can check all that apply. It is a multi-choice question. So just go through there and click things. Agritourism is basically tourism on a farm type of operation. So that might apply to you depending on your role. And then once you click everything that applies, click submit, and then it will come in on my end. Your box should disappear for a moment as all of those questions roll into me. If you have any questions or have an issue finding it, please let me know. And then if you click other, I would appreciate it if you would type in the chat and say, what is other for you? Maybe you're a master gardener, maybe you're a beekeeper, maybe you're just here to learn. Okay, looks like everybody has participated, so thank you so much. We've got a slightly different group than last time, so that's exciting. We've got some people interested in making cider, some people interested in growing apples, a handful of service providers. Excellent. So thank you all for participating. I appreciate that. And I do have another 2 poll questions, but we can address some of these now. But we could also launch that. We can also address these as we go along, depending on your opinions and what kind of feedback you have. So this is a poll question, but that's mainly because I just wanted you to see it and have it pop up. So what challenges do you specifically see for apple growers within the cider industry in West Virginia? So anything you can think of, you can go ahead and put that into the chat box. And along those same type of lines, so that's specifically about growing apples, but we also want to get your feedback on challenges that you see for the wider cider industry in the state. So that could be milling apples, processing apples for juice. That could be transportation of juice to an end production group. It could be just mass distribution. There could be legalities. There's all kinds of stuff, right? And I'm probably influencing what you're going to write, but and I apologize. But anything, challenges for production and the larger cider industry, that's the kind of feedback we want to have. We're looking to see what we can help address and then what will be helpful for the future cider board to also tackle. I'm going to end that. So go ahead and just put that stuff in the chat box and I'll monitor it as we get switched over. I'm going to stop on my end and let you have sharing, Michael.
Okay,
that works.
I'll try to see.
There we go. Excellent.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, and I also need to mention that this is work that is based off of grant funding. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge our West Virginia Department of Agriculture. The materials and the work as part of the cider school is part of funding that comes through the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. This is specifically under a subaward that at the university we've received under the Feasibility Study for West Virginia Economic Development Initiative in cider apple production. This is something that WVU Extension has applied for, but if you're a grower or if you're part of an association, you are eligible to apply for Specialty Crop Block Grant in the future. And if you'd like to do that, please reach out to me, Lisa Jones, and I will be happy to chat with you about opportunities there. So Thank you to our West Virginia Department of Agriculture for helping sponsor this through their funding. And check out the West Virginia Grown program under them in the future if you are interested in getting your products labeled. And now I'm going to be quiet. Michael, I'm turning this over to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael Gutenson, for joining us today as an expert in cider apple production. And I will hand it over. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Glad to see so many people being interested in cider apples. My name is Michael Gutenson. I'm faculty for horticulture in the Division of Plant and Soil Sciences in the Davis College here at West Virginia University. And as Lisa mentioned already, I'm also one of the members of our Appalachian Cider Apple Initiative that we started a couple of years ago here to boost and further develop the cider economy here in the state and in the region. Since Lisa just mentioned the funding that the Extension Service received, I can add on to this. This is by no means the first grant that we got on supporting cider work. Myself and Dr. Danilovich, one of our faculty colleagues here in Extension and in the Division of Plant and Soil Sciences, we have also recently gotten a grant from the West Virginia Department of Ag, and this allowed us to do some of the work that we're doing here. I'll briefly mention some of that today in my presentation, talking about cider apples and in particular about the fruit characteristics, which of course is really central to cider production. Yeah? And I hope that you can take away a few things from today's presentation, seeing that cider apples are quite a bit different from table or sauce apples. So it's quite a bit of different. Okay, let's get started here. I want to talk a little bit about a few things here. I'm going to start off with like very generally talking about beverages. And you can see a couple of the most common ones here that I think most of you are probably familiar here. Here's some red wine, some beer drinking. I had to put this picture in here because I'm a native from Germany and my hometown is Munich, so of course I can't leave the beer out here. But then of course I think many of you probably have consumed either some coffee or tea today already. So I want to start off with a question because I think this sets the tone. Why, and you can answer here in the chat if you want, why do you think we're like drinking beverages? What is it that's most important to us, or an important reason why we're consuming beverages? Well, I hope that a lot of you have, or some of you have, not just thought about, well, you need to drink something, so basically about the water part of it, but that a lot of you have thought also about the taste and flavor of the beverage. Yeah, so it's if it would be just about taking a water, you could drink a glass of water. That's probably it, but water doesn't really taste particularly much. So the reason why many of us are consuming and enjoying a beverage is the taste and the flavor. And of course, that can be quite different. And our perception of some of these things are also quite different. I mean, someone likes, some of us might like one particular beverage and others have a completely different perception on that. Okay. This also, of course, applies to cider as well, hard cider in particular. And in my presentation today, I want to go through a couple of the key characteristics of apple fruit and then also the resulting juice and the beverage, so cider after fermentation, that are important in this context of tastes and flavors. But before I get there, I want to start off with some of the really basic things here, and that is, how do we actually perceive taste and flavor? Yeah, how is it that we humans actually are perceiving these things? And for that, there's two separate parts to this, and the slide here shows the first part of it, and that's taste perception. And what you see here, this is a graphical depiction of our tongue here, and there are certain areas in the tongue where we can perceive certain tastes, and you see that this is actually quite limited. So what we're perceiving when we're drinking something, there's only very few things that we're perceiving with our tongue. And when it comes to cider or many other beverages, it's the bitterness, the sourness or acidity, you could call it, and the sweetness. You see that on the tongue, we also have a perception of salty things in umami, but that's not so much important for a beverage. But bitter, sour, and sweet are three taste characteristics that are really important when we're talking about consuming or enjoying a beverage. But that's not all. There's a huge other aspect to how we perceive things, and that is flavors. You can see here on the left-hand side, this is basically a cross section through a human skull, so to say, and you see that tasting by our tongue is only one part of it. When we're drinking something, and the same applies to eating food, a much more important part of our perception is actually by sniffing, so by smelling, by olfaction through either our nose, but even more important is sort of, if you take up something, some beverage or food in your mouth, there's a connection between your mouth and your nasal cavity, and you basically sniff also with the backside of your mouth through your nose. And this is where a lot of our perception of when we drink something or we eat something, where this is actually happening. If you want to have the right terms, this is, if you sniff through your nose, this is orthonasal. If you sniff through the backside of your mouth, so to say, this is retronasal. In this diagram down there, you see that overall, from the perception of food or a beverage, it's only about 20% that you perceive via your tongue, and 80% is actually perception through your nose. So the sniffing or smelling part is hugely important, how we perceive things. And understanding this is sort of really important when we now talk about the perception of a beverage. I want to start off with an example that is probably more common or more well known to more people, and that is wine tasting. And I just want to use that as an example and then outline a couple of the things, how they relate to cider. So when you're tasting wine, and it's not necessarily said that you need to be an expert in tasting wine, even if you're just an average consumer of an alcoholic beverage like wine, you will probably do something very similar, intentionally or subconsciously. But the first thing is, you're going to look at the beverage in the glass. It's visual appearance, yeah, its color. So in case of wine, and particularly in case of red wine, the darker the color, this equals to a fuller body of the wine. Then one of the next things is probably that you're going to swirl maybe the beverage in the glass a little bit, and then you're actually going to sniff on it. Yeah. So this is your nasal, either through your nose, your nasal perception, your orthonasal perception. And then the last step is basically that you're gonna take a sip of the wine from that glass. And so, of course, in that moment, your receptors, your taste perception on your tongue kicks in. So you're going to taste things. But at the same time, you have that beverage in your mouth, and you're going to start smelling it through the retronasal pathway, yeah, and you're going to be perceiving that as well. So in the end, your overall perception of that wine is a combination of a lot of different things: the visual appearance, then the taste, and the smell. Now, how does that apply to other beverages, and in particular cider? So I'm going to break apart these individual parts here: the seeing, the smelling, and the tasting, and sort of draw comparisons between, for example, other beverages like wine and cider. So this graph here, you see these are different colors of wine. And of course, everyone knows that the principal distinction with respect to wine is you can have red wine and white wine. And that's, of course, an interesting question here. Is that something we can have with cider as well? Most of you probably, if I would ask you what's the color of apple juice, you will probably say it looks like white wine. It's yellowish, clear. Maybe it's a little bit turbid if it's an unfiltered apple juice. But most of you, or all of you, probably would not say that, well, there's red apple juice. Well, as a matter of fact, there is red colored cider, rosé, or actually really red colored cider, as you see in these pictures here. And so knowing this now, of course, the question is, how do we achieve that? Where do we get red colored cider or apple juice? Well, all you know that there's red apples, and there's a pigment that is responsible for that. Those pigments are called anthocyanins. Not very important here. Anthocyanins are a pigment that are found in a lot of fruits, not just apples. So they're actually health promoting. So that's why you're supposed to eat your berries here: raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries. Also in grapes, the red color red grapes is also anthocyanin. So this is nothing specific to apples. It's quite common. In case of apples, most apples, if it's a red apple, these apple varieties accumulate this red pigment in their skin. And you see a couple of examples here. The color can change over the period of ripening of an apple, so it can increase. If you cut it open, you clearly see that the red pigment is only in the skin, not in the fruit flesh, actually. And that's already a problem, because if you produce juice out of such an apple, very little of this pigment, if at all, will end up in the juice. So you will get an apple juice that looks pretty normal, yellowish, maybe orange, but by no means red. If you really want to have a red apple juice, you're going to use very specific apple varieties. And there is a couple apple varieties, and the number of them available is increasing by now. Some of them are crab apple varieties, but there are apple varieties out there that accumulate this pigment, these anthocyanins, actually in the fruit flesh, so in the fruit pericarp. And you see a couple of pictures down here, examples of those. So now in this case, you still have the pigment in the skin, but now you also have it in the fruit flesh and the fruit pericarp. And if you process these fruits and produce juice out of them, you obtain red juice, or rosé pinkish juice. And if you use that juice for fermentation, then of course in the end you get a red colored cider. So this is the color. So you're not limited to cider that is only yellow or white, how you would call it, but you can produce red colored cider. The next aspect that I want to talk about is the taste characteristics. And remember what I showed you in the beginning, that this human tongue. So I'm talking about those characteristics that you can basically perceive with your tongue. And in this respect, cider apple varieties or apple varieties that you're using for making cider, many of them are quite different from table and sauce apples. There's 3 different characteristics, like I said before: the bitterness, the sharpness or sourness or acidity, and then the sweetness. And on the left-hand side, you see that there's basically 4 classes of apples that you can have, and they're all distinct in these 3 different features here. So what the one distinction that you're probably more used from regular table apples or sauce apples is the difference between the sweet apple and the sharp apple. Because that's something that you can also find in table and sauce apples. The sweetness is basically just determined by the sugar content. So of course, the sweeter an apple is, the more sugar content or the more sugar it contains. The sharpness or acidity comes from malic acid, which is a typical fruit sugar found in apple fruits and also other fruits. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The other big difference between different apple varieties is the bitterness. And that is determined by the content of polyphenols and tannins. And I'll speak a little bit more about those in a minute. But basically, you have apples that are bitter. So you have bitter sharp or bitter sweet varieties that are very high in polyphenols and tannins, and then you have others that have very little of the polyphenols and tannins, and by that they're then either just sweet or sharp. So that's on that end. The low tannin ones are the ones that you're used to as a table or sauce apples, versus when you want to make a cider, you're rather leaning towards the bitter sharp or bitter sweet ones. Now, what's really important here to consider is if you're making a cider, many cider brands actually use for the production a blend of different apple varieties. And this allows you to basically combine different desired sensory characteristics by basically mixing different apples, or you choose from different apple varieties. So it's almost like a cooking recipe where you're taking a little bit of different things and combining them, and the final product is basically made by mixing certain flavors and tastes together. Yeah, so basically like making your favorite chocolate cake or fruit tart or something like that. Yeah, you're mixing different ingredients, and in the end you get a final product with a certain flavor, mix of flavors and tastes. So for the next couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit more about these taste characteristics of cider apples, and sort of give you a better understanding where some of these things are coming from, or actually make you realize that some of those things you know from maybe in a different context. So let's first talk a little bit about these tannins and polyphenols. This is by no means something specific to apple fruits. These compounds, these tannins and polyphenols, are found in leaves and the bark and in fruits of many plants. Very often they're in particularly high concentrations in unripe fruits, and this is actually a slide that I took from one of my lectures in my classes here. And so the example that I always give my students here is the example of the unripe banana or ripening bananas. And I'm sure some of you went to the grocery store and occasionally you buy a bunch of bananas, and they're still a little bit, I mean, they might not be as green as they here, but they're a little bit more sort of on the greenish, little unripe side. And if you end up biting or tasting such a somewhat unripe banana, you probably remember that you end up with this very dry mouthfeel, yeah? And if you bite into this. This is exactly caused, this dry mouthfeel, that's caused by the tannins and polyphenols. And that's the same sort of taste that you would perceive if you drink a good dry white wine. This dryness this dry mouthfeel. This is exactly what the tannins and polyphenols give you. And to some extent, this can also give you a bitter taste. This bitter taste actually, biologically, is serving the plant as a repellent for certain pests or animals. So it's actually something that keeps particularly insects away from nibbling around on the plant. So it's a protective means for the plant. These tannins and polyphenols are important for our perception of a lot of different food items or beverages, and just a couple of examples here. So tannins are found not just in apple fruits, but they're also found in grapes here, and of course with that, they're also hugely important for the perception of red wine. They're found in tea, and last but not least, and that's something that some of you might not suspect, in chocolate. In particular, the somewhat bitter taste of really dark chocolate. That is caused by tannins. So we humans are used to this, and we actually tend to enjoy this, particularly more adult people, maybe not children. But so tannins and polyphenols are an important taste characteristic that is sought by us. The other taste characteristic that I briefly want to mention here again is the malic acid. So that this is the sourness or acidity or sharpness. And as I mentioned before, malic acid is by no means something, again, specific to apples. This slide here shows some of the most common acids that you find in fruits, and some of you might be more familiar with the citric acid, which is found, as the name says, in citrus fruits a lot. So in your lemon, your orange juice, your grapefruit, they contain a lot of citric acid. But in other fruits, you find quite a lot of malic acid, and apple is one of those. And you see down here in the graph that in this diagram, there's a couple other ones here. So in your cherries, your grapes, there's malic acid. So this is by no means something unique to apples, quite common. But the amount of these acids really determine sort of our perception of this. The next two slides basically just show you sort of the diversity of different apple varieties, in particular also cider apples now here. And I don't want to make any advertisement here. I just took a couple of slides here from that I found on the internet that nicely summarize sort of this huge diversity of different apple varieties and sort of these different taste characteristics that they basically give you. So when you look at this graph here, you see on the very left-hand side, this is all more your table apples. So your Yona Gold or your Cox or some of these things. And when you look on the bottom left-hand side of these squares, you see there's two numbers listed here. The one on the left-hand side, bottom left-hand side, is indicating the amount or concentration of malic acid. So this is your acidity, your sharpness, your sourness, basically. And you can see that there's a little bit of a difference. The ones are in the second row here, they're a little bit lower. So these would be your apples that were more sweet apples. And then the ones in the very left-hand column, like your Yona Gold or your Cox, they're a little bit more on the sharp side, but those are all table apples, basically. And now if you compare those and go to the very right-hand side here, you see everything that's on the right-hand side here, these are cider apples. And now if you compare the numbers here, the second number is really the important one. So this one here, which determines it depicts the concentration or amount of tannin in these apples. And if you look over here, some of these tremlets bitter like has 3.4 grams per liter of tannin. This can go up to 5 when you look at some of the other varieties here. So all of those apples here on this side, all these cider apple varieties have very high tannin concentrations. And if you compare that with what you find over here on the left-hand side with your table apples, this is much lower. Yeah, I mean, you have 5.0 here versus anything between 1.0 and 1.4 grams per liter of tannins. So these are much richer in tannin. And of course, the taste perception, if you consume those or bite into these apples, is a completely different one. So some of these apples are actually called spitters. So if you bite in them, you will not enjoy eating them because they're so bitter and so dry. But this is exactly what you're seeking when you're trying to produce a good cider. Another slide here with even more variety, but again, you can sort of see the differences between these four different types of apples: sweet, sharp, and then bittersweet and bitter sharp. And keep in mind what I just said before. Basically, you could make a cider just from one variety, and I'm not saying that you won't find ciders out there in the market that are made from just one apple variety, but you will find in many cases that cider makers use a mixture of different apple varieties by basically combining these different properties. This is a graph, and I don't want to go into too much detail here. This is from a publication of two of our collaborators, one group at Virginia Tech University and one at Cornell University, that have analyzed some of these basic taste characteristics in a set of different apple fruits. And what I'm highlighting here is three different important things. On the very right-hand side, you can see the total content of tannins or polyphenols here for these different apple varieties. The second column here, highlighted in red, that's your titratable acid TA, which is basically that's the amount of malic acid, and you can see there's huge differences here. Yeah, ranging all from 2.58 here, so very little, to over 11 here. So there's huge span here. And then what's listed here is soluble solids. This is basically given in bricks. This is basically your sweetness. So the sugar content, and this is important. The content of sugar is important not just for your taste perception, but keep in mind you're trying to make a hard cider, so you're wanting to do a fermentation. Your fermentation needs sugar. Your yeasts need sugar that they can ferment, and of course you need to have respective amounts of sugar in your apple juice or in the apple, and so this determines to some extent the alcohol content of your final beverage that you're producing. Yeah, sorry, it's lighting up here now. So it's sweetness, sharpness, and bitterness, the three taste characteristics that are really important. And you see the large variation in the different apple varieties here. This is again showing sort of the content of polyphenols. One thing that I wanted to point out, similar to the anthocyanins, so the red pigment before, these polyphenols and tannins are found in the skin of the apple, but also in the flesh. But you see that there's a huge difference in the amount here. This is shown here on the right-hand side in this graph. So there's less of these polyphenols found is actually in the fruit pericarp or flesh, and way more of it shown in these gray bars here in the peel. And of course, the question is, again, if you're processing these apples, how much of that actually ends up in your juice? And it's pretty clear that the majority of this comes from the flesh and not necessarily the peel. But as shown here on the left-hand side in the graph here, This shows that the content of polyphenols in the peel compared to the flesh, there is a correlation. So if you have a lot of it in the peel, you also have more in the flesh. And if you have little in the peel, you also will have less in the flesh. So overall, you can characterize apple varieties by either having a lot of polyphenols and tannins or little of it. With that, I'd like to switch a little bit, and that's something, so far, this is something that most people are sort of somewhat familiar with. And these apple varieties are even characterized in these categories of bittersweet, bitter sharp, sharp or sweet. Things become really much more complex now if we're talking about aroma and flavor. And that's the part that is what you're perceiving via your nose. So not your tongue, not your taste. This is what you're basically smelling. But this is hugely important basically for the overall perception in the end. And this is where cider apple varieties and then also hard ciders in the end differ hugely. So like the statement down here says, while bitter and sharp apples are often lauded for their contributions to a hard cider, don't forget to mix in apples that bring aroma and flavor. Yeah, it's not just about sharpness and bitterness or acidity and this dry mouthfeel. It's about really the flavor. This wheel here on the left-hand side is called an aroma or flavor wheel or profile. And what I've highlighted here on the left-hand side with these arrows, this is what we've been talking about so far. We've talked about the taste, so sweetness, sourness, bitterness. And initially I talked a little bit about the color. So we're talking about something that's yellow, light yellow, or red. But if you look at, this is only these two little sectors of the wheel. The entire rest of the wheel here, this is all your flavors and aromas. And you can see that there's different sensory terms that are used in this context. So how people, what they sort of associate when you perceive such a smell. And that is certain sort of terms, but also sort of very often it's related to other plants or food items that smell or taste similar or have a similar flavor or aroma. So there's a huge diversity there. And so I want to speak a little bit about how you get what's relevant or important or what we know about when we're talking about the flavors and aromas concerning cider here. This graph here shows, like it's called the chemistry of cider. And as you might have realized by now, some of this has some relevance to chemistry. And I don't want to bother you too much with it, but I want to point out a few things. So we talked about the fruit acids here. Here's our malic acid again. We talked about the tannins here, and you see complex chemical structure here. We talked about sweetness here, not so much important right now. But I want to talk for the next couple of minutes a little bit about this last part here, the what's called here the aroma chemicals. So the aroma and flavor, and then since this is a little bit small, I blew it out here so you can read it a little bit better here. And they're just highlighting a few things here. So one thing they're pointing out is there's this 1,3-octane diol, which basically is converted to another compound, but is really important. And then there's a couple of other things here. Among those things is, for example, 2-phenyl ethanol, quite common aroma compound. I want you to keep that in mind for a moment, because I'll come back to that in a little bit. So a huge part of what we are doing here at West Virginia University, in my lab and also in some of the collaborators' labs here, is we're analyzing these aroma and flavor compounds. And I don't want to go in too much detail, but I want to give you a little bit of an idea of how we do that actually. So on this slide here on the right-hand side, you see a very sort of somewhat simple setup of how we do that. So how do we collect these aroma or flavor compounds? So one of the first things that I should remind you is that these are the parts of our perception that we're perceiving by our nose. So we're smelling them. So if you want to smell something, that means basically from that glass of cider or wine or the apple you're biting into, until you're receiving it into your nose, there's actually a gas phase in between. So something has to be emitted from that glass of cider into the atmosphere, into the air, so to say, and then you're sniffing that, perceiving it from the air with your nose. And so, not surprisingly, these compounds that we're talking about here, these aroma and flavor compounds, are compounds, chemical compounds that go into the gas phase very easily. They're emitted into the gas phase very easily. And so, not surprising, they're called, that's the official chemical term, they're called volatile organic compounds. Volatile just means that they're volatilized, they're emitted, they're going into the gas phase very, very quickly. And there's two ways of analyzing those, and one is actually to collect them out of the gas phase, and that's what you see here on the slide here on the right hand side. So what we can do, we can enclose, for example, an apple here. You can see down here is an apple. Enclose it in a glass jar, basically, and then we have a little air pump here. On the one hand side, we're pumping air into this glass container. On the other one side, we're sucking it out. And on this outside here, and this is a little bit highlighted because it's a glass tube and a little bit difficult to see. So this is basically where you see that yellow tube highlighted here. There's a little device. It's basically capable of capturing or trapping any of these volatile compounds that are here in the air. So if the apple emits something here in the air phase here, it's sucked out and then it gets trapped here. And once we have it trapped there, we can get it off from there, and then we can analyze it. The other way of doing the analysis, of course, you take your apple, you chop it up in pieces, and you simply take a solvent, and you're basically washing out these compounds out of the fruit tissue. Second step then for analyzing these compounds is actually the separation of them and the identification. Well, you have to keep in mind, if you're analyzing the flavor and the aroma compounds in an apple or any other fruit, for example, these fruits don't contain just one compound. Normally this is a mix of many different compounds in different amounts, some very little, others very abundant. And so before we can figure out what's actually in there, we first have to separate them. Yeah? We can't analyze a mixture. We need to analyze them individually. And this is basically what we're doing here with some very sophisticated machinery here. This is called gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. The gas chromatography part is basically nothing else than you're injecting here, and it's shown here in the simple graph. You're injecting a sample, like the ones that we just collected before, in this machine. And then there's a very long hollow tube where we're streaming some gas through, and some of these compounds move through this tube quicker and others slower. So in the end, basically, they're coming off individually here. And then the mass spectrometry here on the downside of it is nothing else than a technology that allows us to identify individual chemical compounds. And I really don't want to go into the details here. Don't want to bother you with that. But basically, this allows us to identify each of these compounds. In the end, what you get from such a run is basically such a curve like down here, and you see these little spikes here. Yeah? As a matter of fact, each of these spikes is one individual compound. And so in the end, we can basically identify how many compounds are in such a mixture of things that we extracted from a fruit, and we can say which are what chemicals are these compounds, basically. So here on this slide, I'm showing you an example of just two apples, and these are actually no cider apples, but just apples that you probably find in any grocery store, Gala and Honeycrisp. I'm sure most of you have consumed some of those at some point. And you see there's a lot of these compounds in there. So we're easily talking about 50 or even more individual compounds. And I just highlighted with numbers here a couple of those that we identified in there. And I want to come back to one because that was on one of those slides that I showed you before, which highlighted that this is an important aroma or flavor compound in apple fruits. This is number 12 here, and this is our 1,3-octan diol here. And in particular, I want to point out, you see that these two colors, these curves here in these two colors depict the two different apple varieties, Gala and Honeycrisp. And the one compound that is really present in hugely different amounts is exactly number 12 here. Yeah. See, in Honeycrisp, there's a huge amount of this here, and this is a huge peak here, versus in the Gala, it's still an important compound, but it's by far not as prominent as in the Honeycrisp here. And as you might know, Honeycrisp is actually not just a very good table apple, but a lot of people also like it for making sweet cider, so non-alcoholic cider that your kids or you can drink. And so one of the reasons why people probably like it very much is this compound here. So we can analyze all these compounds, but you see that there's a huge difference between different apple varieties. And this is again from a publication from another group here. And I don't want to go into too much detail. What you see here on top is a list of all these different compounds that they found in some apple fruits here, and you don't have to bother about it. You just, again, see that there's a lot of differences. But what is important here is on the left-hand side, this is basically sensory parameters. So basically, this is how people do perceive apples, or what sort of known flavors or aromas people perceive from sniffing or consuming an apple. And see, there's a lot of other things here. And there's a correlation, positive or negative, and this is what this color code here really shows. Blue is positive, red is negative, of these flavor, these sensory perceptions, basically, with the presence or absence of some of these chemical flavor compounds. So now you really can go into sort of dissecting these things. But what I really want you to take from this here is that there's a lot of these compounds, and they have very different perceptions, but they don't show up as individual compounds. They're always in a mix with other things, and this really is what makes basically making a good beverage in general, or making a good cider, somewhat of an art, really complicated, because you basically have to figure out what's in an apple, what flavor is there, and how do people perceive this. So it's not the basic taste, sharpness and bitterness or sweetness. A huge part of your perception of that final product basically comes from these flavor and aroma compounds. And there's not one given perception. One person might like one type of flavor more, or prefer that more over something else, and you take the next person and it's the exact opposite. So there's not a right or wrong. It's just, you need to be aware that there's a lot of diversity there. Okay, so I want to again point out one other aspect of what we're doing here at West Virginia in that respect. As I think I outlined before already, we're looking into these flavor and aroma compounds in a lot of different apple varieties. We actually established and are developing 2 collection orchards. One here at the Animal Science Farm here in Morgantown. This orchard by now is 4 years old, and we can finally really harvest apples and start doing some of the real research work that we want to do. We started a second, basically similar or practically identical orchard over at the second farm in Kearneysville, which is here in the Eastern Panhandle, which ultimately will host the same collection of about over 40 different cider apple varieties. And then we're also collaborating with 2 of the cideries here in the States, the Swilt Dock cidery and the Hawk Knob cidery, which is down all the way in the south here. of West Virginia. And they're also growing some of these apple varieties, so we're working with them. And ultimately, what we want to achieve with this is not only testing these different apple varieties and their flavor profiles, but we also are trying to figure out what influence the environment has on the flavor profiles, because the accumulation of these compounds is also a response of the plant to its environment. And so one and the same apple variety could have quite a distinct flavor depending on where you're growing it and under what environment. And that can be things like soil, weather conditions, temperature, humidity. There's a lot of different factors that can influence the outcome here. And so to be able to do that, we are basically trying to grow apples in different environments and then compare and see how the environment basically is influencing the accumulation of these flavor compounds in these apple varieties. I'm now coming to sort of the last part of my presentation, and I still want to point out a few things here. So far we have talked about different cider apple varieties and sort of the different taste characteristics they bring in, the sweetness, the bitterness, the sharpness. In the last couple of minutes, I talked a little bit about the large diversity of these flavor and aroma compounds. The last aspect in this context that I want to point out a little bit is sort of more the process of making cider and what influence that has on the flavor and the taste here, particularly the flavor. So when you're harvesting some of these fruits in the end, you're storing and then you're processing them. So basically you're making juice out of them. And then the second step is, of course, your fermentation process. And what's really important to understand is that in each and all of these steps, of course, something can happen to your taste and flavor compounds here. Yeah? Just because they've been in the apple doesn't mean that they're going to be ending up in the same way in your juice or in your cider in the end. And that's really something you have to consider. So this is just a little bit more detailed slide here. So the big question is, what happens to these taste and flavor compounds during this somewhat lengthy process of cider production? And this starts already pretty early on. I mean, simple questions that are covered up here. So you harvest, do you store your apples or do you sort of process them immediately? Yeah. Then, or for example, do you go right away, you mash and then juice them right away, but you store the juice before starting fermentation? Then of course the whole process down here, how after mashing and how quickly do you really sort of separate the pulp from the juice? Yeah. You remember what I said before, that there's with the pigments as well as, for example, with the polyphenols and tannins, a lot of these compounds are in the skin of apple fruits. And we have some indication that that probably also holds true for some of these flavor and aroma compounds. There might be more of them in the skin of the fruit than in the flesh. But some of these things get out of the skin very slowly, if at all. So it could be a benefit storing these juice and basically pulp together for a while, but there could be also off flavors getting out. So again, there's a balance between how you handle things. And then of course, a lot of things can happen during fermentation. So basically you're bringing in other organisms, yeast and bacteria, that can do the fermentation. So they basically take the sugar and some other metabolites, other compounds that are in the apple juice, and they convert them in alcohol. But these microbes, these microorganisms also convert other chemical compounds in there into other things. And that includes some of these taste and in particular some of these flavor compounds. So again, this can have an influence. And this is sort of summarized a little bit. One aspect here is summarized in this one of my last slides here. So the yeast strain that you're using has an influence on the flavor profile of the cider in the end. Not only are they potentially converting some of the existing flavor compounds that are in your apple juice, but actually microbes or yeast in particular can also produce their own flavor compounds, and then of course leave those behind or add those to the profile that you find in the final cider. So there's a huge difference there. One aspect we're working on, for example, is looking at the distinction between what's called natural fermentation. So basically, if you're relying in your fermentation process on the yeast that are found on the apple itself, versus using either beer or wine or champagne yeast for the fermentation process, which gives you a little bit more of a control of what's happening. But the natural yeast that are found on the apples might give you a more distinct, more different flavor profile. So we're actually trying to identify a little bit more of these yeasts that are found in apples, particularly also because they're most likely more adapted to the environment, so to say, of an apple fruit. So that they're more adapted to being or existing or utilizing things provided by an apple fruit. A beer or wine yeast is adapted to working with grape juice, for example, not apple juice necessarily. So there might be things that we can learn out of there. So that's just one other aspect. On the flip side, of course, I want to point out that natural fermentation, there is a certain risk there because you do not just have yeast on your apples, you also have bacteria on there, and some of it could spoil and go bad, and or give you some very odd off flavors that you don't want, or that are not necessarily perceived favorable by a consumer in the end. But when we're talking about tastes and flavors, that part is definitely something you have to keep in mind, that your flavors that you find in your final product are not just coming from the apple or the juice that you're making out of it, but there's something happening in the moment you're adding your microbes, your yeast, and your bacteria to it. And with that, I'm at the end. I'm glad so many of you are interested in the presentation here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So if you'd like to ask a question to Michael, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Or if you don't want to unmute, if maybe your background's loud, I totally understand that. You can go ahead and put your question in the chat box. So Michael, there is a question from Andy. Question I have with respect to old varieties of apples, which can occasionally be found still living where home sites were prior to the 1930s. Could some of these varieties be potentially good cider apples? My thought is homesteads prior to the 30s may have apples planted for that purpose, and there may be rare varieties that could be cultivated to build an orchard. So maybe you can talk about the cider team project.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and we were also thinking about that. So yes, you're right. Apples in old times, so to say, were not just grown for fruit, for consuming fruits, but they were grown for the purpose of making cider. So there is a good chance that some of those old apple varieties or old trees, abandoned trees that you might find out there, are actually very good, or could be very good cider apples. It's not, there's no guarantee, but yes, of course, you're absolutely right. One other thought, and that's why we're also looking into this with our team here at West Virginia University, is apple trees that are around, sort of abandoned old apple trees that are around, they're around for a very long time. and that means they survived for a very long time without much care, and very likely they're well adapted to the environment where they're growing. So, and this is exactly what we're trying to figure out. I mean, we can give you a whole list of cider apple varieties, but there's no guarantee, or unfortunately, there's so far not that much knowledge yet, which apple varieties perform particularly well or good in a certain environment. So here in the Appalachian regions, or in the Mid-Atlantic region, or wherever you go. I mean, the question is really sort of, does a certain variety do well in a certain region? Yes or no? And there's really no given answer. A lot of different universities or places are trying to figure these things out right now, because we have to figure that out for each region. But if you go out and find a tree that is there for, I don't know, 50 years or even more, almost maybe 100 years or 80 years, well, there's a pretty good chance that apple made it for such a long time without much care. So it will probably perform pretty well. So this is the one of the logics or reasons for looking at these old apple varieties, and like you said, in old homesteads or places. Yeah.
And I guess to follow up with that, if you think you have a rare apple that people don't know about, you can always contact Michael or Mira or even me if you want to. I'm not the apple expert.
Yeah.
But
Mirror is your best shot.
yes, and Mira will take the cyan, so that first year growth, and put it into the collection here, and
Yeah.
we can check that out. So Kathy said, does West Virginia have any cider only orchards? There were certain varieties she had not heard of before.
Some of the cideries that I mentioned before, they have their own orchards or have started their own orchards. And of course, they're primarily growing cider apples. There's not, to my knowledge, there is not any real big commercial orchard that is just specialized on cider apples so far. And this is one sort of, not just for West Virginia, but the availability of cider apples or apples from cider apple varieties is one of the biggest bottlenecks in this entire industry or economy. Whenever you talk with the cider makers in here, but also in some of the other states around, one of their biggest issues is getting their hands on fruits of cider apple varieties. This is so, and this is also one of the reasons why, when you, let's say you're contemplating about starting your own small orchard somewhere, the revenue that you can make with growing cider apples in average will be higher than if you would be growing table or sauce apples, because the cider makers pay a premium for getting those. First of all, because they're not for consumption, they're not table apples. Like I said, some of them are these very bitter, very untasty, sort of for normal, regular consumption apples, where they're only are used for cider making. And there are simply not that many orchards or growers that grow some of those yet. So this is exactly what we're trying to promote. One other thing that really you should keep in mind in growing cider apples is there's less of a focus on the appearance of these apples. Yeah, that these apples never going to end up in a shelf in a grocery store where people, and each and all of us can admit that if you go buy fruits in the grocery store, in a store, you very much look for the appearance. So you want to have this nicely evenly shaped apple, no blemish, no nothing. Well, these apples are juiced. You never see how the apple looked like in the end. What you're perceiving is the taste and flavor of it and the color, but not how this apple looked before. So the focus of growing those, what you're looking for is something completely different than when you're growing a table apple.
Just a real brief comment. This is Bill Shockey. I'm an extension agent up in Preston County. And for a number of years, I don't even know how many now, I'm getting too old to count, but I worked with Adams County Nursery in Pennsylvania. And we had a lot of producers that had some of these old orchards and had, their favorite trees and wanted to try to propagate them because they were nearing end of life. And they worked very well with us. We probably 100 or more varieties over the years that we worked here. I did not keep track of what they were using them for, cooking, eating, cider or whatnot. But I will say one of the difficulties we had was trying to determine just what variety we had. You go to what had been an old homestead, and when you stand there and look a little bit, you might only have 5 or 6 trees out there. But when you really look, you can see they were lined up at one time, and there was probably maybe 30 or 40 trees in this huge orchard, which doesn't exist anymore. So although they liked the apple, what it was used for, they really didn't know what it was. Some folks at Kearneysville were able to identify some, but really it's kind of a losing cause. So I don't know, any suggestions on trying to, unless I guess you happen to be lucky and you have a grandparent or great grandparent that maybe has the old original planting map. It's kind of tough to determine what you've got.
Yeah, that's a good point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, if there's no good documentation or so, or at least verbal transmission of information over generations, things become pretty complicated at some point. I think the only thing nowadays, and I mean, I'm not a breeder, but I mean, I'm a geneticist, so of course our genetic tools nowadays are so much more sophisticated than they were just 20 years ago. So there's, if absolutely necessary for really identifying what variety is or what's in a certain variety that you find somewhere, you can go the route of doing some more sophisticated genetic analysis. Although this might not tell you exactly what variety it is or what name it had, but at least you can establish some sort of relationship to other known things. Yeah, because I mean, even older varieties are probably bred by crossing it or combining it with other things. So you can tap into some of that, and there's a growing, for a lot of crops, and I mean, apple is one of the most important fruit crops. There is a growing base of data on that end. I mean, keep in mind, for example, there's the huge collection, USDA apple collection up in Geneva, where they have like hundreds of different apple varieties. And of course, some of what these folks are doing is not just collecting and preserving, which of course is important, but that's not the only thing. This goes along with a lot of sort of more genetic research as well. And there are databases and there's information nowadays, and sort of the price for some of these analysis has come down tremendously. I mean, if we would have been talking about this 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we would be talking about something that's very expensive and takes a lot of time. Nowadays, a lot of these things can be done with a fraction of that cost in very short amount of time. So it's way more feasible doing that on a much larger scale and actually figuring some of these informations out. And then actually, even if you preserve, I mean, right now, I think that the most important thing, what we all really have to do, and this is why we're also getting involved in that, is just simply preserving things before they're terminally gone forever. Yeah. I mean, even some of these old trees, they don't live forever. So we don't preserve things now and do what Mira is doing right now, is literally taking sandwood and sort of trying to graft and conserve things and put it in our collection orchards here or in any other collection orchard, we're really going the risk of some things being gone forever. And that once it's gone, it's really hard getting it back. Yeah.
Well, if anyone else has questions, feel free to either chime in or put it in the chat box. Just so you know, if you missed session number 1, which happened on Wednesday last week on apple cultivars, I have gone ahead and put that link into the chat box if you want to see it. I also did send it out in an email recently, and I will send it out again whenever I send out the recording for this video as well. All of our presentations are being recorded that are virtual over Zoom, so not the tours, but all of the recordings on Zoom will be put onto YouTube, and that way you can access them at a later date. I think the one from last week is up. It does say it's processing still, so I'm not really sure how long it's going to take to render out, just so you know. And then just a really quick note for next week. So next week's session is on apple insect management. It is to be Wednesday, June 8th, again from noon to 1. Right now on our schedule, it says Dr. Carlos Casada is supposed to be with us. However, he has informed me that he and his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Rowan, are expecting twins, and those twins are arriving earlier than originally anticipated. So he will not be able to join us next week. So I am looking for another entomologist right now to hopefully take his place, or we might switch next week and the week after because they are both IPM pest management types of topics. The one next week just happens to be on insects, and the week after that happens to be on diseases. Both of them have to do with apple production topics if you're here for apple production. So just make that note. We might change classes, we'll see. And I will send out a message as soon as I get an official word from somebody. Again, if you have questions, let us know. If not, thank you for joining us today. And we really, really appreciate you participating. Feel free to email me at any point. And if you have not already put into the chat box challenges that you would love for us to help address related to apple production or the greater cider industry in West Virginia, please do that now before you leave today. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.